A black pilot was asked to step outside. Minutes later, the entire airline would regret it. Jordan Carter strode down the brightly lit corridor of Hudson Gateway Airport, his polished black shoes clicking against the tiles with each purposeful step. The hum of airport chatter surrounded him, flight announcements echoing overhead, the distant whir of conveyor belts, moving luggage, hurried passengers weaving through the crowds. He barely noticed any of it. His mind was on the day ahead. Today wasn't just another flight, it was his first as captain for Titan Airways. His navy blue uniform was pristine, his 4 golden stripes gleaming against his sleeves, a symbol of authority, experience, and the years of hard work that had led him here. At 37 years old, with 15,000 flight hours and a decorated career in the U.S. Air Force, including 3 tours in Afghanistan, Jordan had seen and done more in the skies than most pilots would in a lifetime. Flying wasn't just a job for him, it was who he was. As he approached the crew briefing room, he adjusted the cuff of his uniform. He had triple-checked today's flight plan the night before. The route from Chicago to Seattle was one he knew well. Challenging weather patterns, tricky landings, but nothing he hadn't mastered before. He reached the door, took a breath, and pushed it open. And immediately, he felt it. The shift in the air. Inside, the crew briefing room was eerily quiet. The usual pre-flight chatter was absent. Conversations that should have been lively, pilots discussing flight conditions, attendants reviewing safety protocols, had turned into something unnatural. Jordan's sharp eyes quickly took in the scene. Standing near the head of the room was Charles Whitman, the CEO of Titan Airways, a man known for his cold, calculating demeanor. Beside him stood Captain Gerald Monroe, a veteran pilot in his mid-50s, his hair dusted with silver. Monroe had years of experience, but Jordan recognized something else in his face, a smirk, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Before Jordan could say a word, Whitman spoke first, his voice clipped, professional, but edged with finality. "Captain Carter, please step outside." The words landed like a punch to the gut. Jordan blinked, thrown off by the sudden command. "Excuse me?" His voice remained level, but a note of confusion crept in. "I'm the assigned captain for this flight. There must be some kind of mistake." Whitman didn't blink. "No mistake. Please wait outside." Jordan's eyes darted to Monroe, who simply watched, arms crossed, his half-smile unwavering. The room was stiff with tension. Something was wrong. None of the other crew members made eye contact. Some glanced at their flight plans. Others looked at the floor. The few younger pilots in the room shifted uncomfortably, their expressions filled with unease. Jordan felt his stomach tighten. His instincts, honed from years in the military, screamed that this wasn't just a procedural change. This was something bigger. Seconds stretched painfully. Finally, Whitman cleared his throat. "There's been a change in assignment." He gestured toward Monroe. "Captain Monroe will be flying this route today. You've been reassigned." Jordan narrowed his eyes. "Reassigned?" He glanced at Monroe, who met his gaze with an expression of quiet triumph. "I'm sure you don't mind, Carter," Monroe said smoothly. His voice was polite, but the sarcasm was unmistakable. Jordan's fingers curled around the handle of his flight bag. He wasn't new to the industry. Pilots weren't swapped out minutes before a flight without a serious reason. And certainly not like this. His voice was steady but firm. "I was assigned this flight weeks ago. I've prepared for every detail. Why is this happening?" Whitman exchanged a glance with Monroe before replying in a mechanical tone. "We reassessed the situation and decided that for today's route, we need someone with more experience in Titan Airways procedures." Jordan almost laughed. More experience? He had 15,000 hours in the air. He had flown in combat zones, navigated brutal storms, landed in conditions that would make other pilots freeze up. But he didn't let his anger show. Instead, he spoke slowly, deliberately. "With all due respect, I have flown hundreds of landings in Seattle under severe weather conditions. I am more than qualified." Whitman shrugged, his face unreadable. "This isn't up for debate. Please wait outside." The message was clear. It didn't matter how qualified he was. This had nothing to do with experience. Jordan scanned the room once more. Not one person spoke up. A few flight attendants exchanged nervous glances, but no one dared challenge the decision. This wasn't just about today. He wasn't the first, and if he backed down quietly, he wouldn't be the last. Jordan inhaled deeply, Taking a step back didn't mean surrendering, it meant choosing the right moment to strike. Slowly he set his flight documents on the table. Then with calm, calculated movements, he buttoned his uniform. He turned to Monroe, holding his gaze for a moment, as if burning his face into memory. Then he smiled. "Safe flight, Captain," he said coolly. Then he walked out. The door clicked shut behind him. Outside, in the dimly lit hallway, Jordan clenched his fists. He could feel it, the rage simmering beneath the surface, the unfairness of it, the cold efficiency with which they had removed him as if he were nothing. The airport felt colder than before. He moved through the terminal, past flight attendants who averted their gazes, past pilots who hurried by without a word, and then his phone buzzed. A new assignment. He glanced at the screen. Reassignment, co-pilot position. Paired with Captain Leonard Hayes. Jordan exhaled slowly. Leonard Hayes, a veteran pilot known for his open disdain toward black pilots. Jordan knew exactly what was happening. They wanted him to quit. They wanted him humiliated, but they didn't realize who they were dealing with. Jordan straightened his shoulders, adjusted his uniform, and walked toward his next battle, because this fight was just beginning. Jordan Carter had heard plenty about Captain Leonard Hayes long before he was assigned to fly with him. With over 30 years of experience, Hayes had built a reputation that was both respected and feared. But his fame didn't just come from his skills as a pilot. It came from something far more toxic: his blatant disdain for black pilots, his outspoken opposition to women in the captain's seat, and his firm belief that aviation was a place for the old guard to keep control. Jordan had overheard the whispered conversations in the pilot lounges, the stories of Hayes mocking young black pilots, of him shutting down discussions about diversifying the industry, of him deliberately hindering the careers of those he thought didn't belong. And now, Jordan was stuck as his co-pilot. As he stepped into the cockpit of the Titan Airways Boeing 737, Hayes was already in the captain's chair. He didn't turn to acknowledge Jordan. Instead, he gave a quick glance through the small rear-view mirror, his eyes flicking up for a second, just long enough to register who had walked in. Then he smirked. Not a greeting, not a sign of recognition, just a silent message: "You don't belong here." Jordan said nothing as he slid into the co-pilot's seat. "Just sit down, watch, and learn. If you can," Hayes muttered, his tone laced with sarcasm. Jordan bit back a response. He had dealt with men like Hayes before. The ones who believed they owned the sky, the ones who thought they could decide who was worthy to fly. This was their game, and they wanted him to play by their rules. But Jordan wasn't here to play. He was here to prove them wrong. As they went through pre-flight checks, Hayes barely acknowledged Jordan's presence. He communicated with the flight attendants, spoke directly to air traffic control, and made adjustments to the control panel, all without consulting his co-pilot. To any outsider looking in, Jordan would have seemed like a trainee, not a highly skilled pilot with thousands of hours in the air. But Jordan wasn't a rookie. He had flown military aircraft through war zones. He had landed in near-impossible conditions. He had trained for the worst and survived it. So instead of reacting to the deliberate dismissal, he did what he had learned to do best. He observed. As the Boeing 737 pushed back from the gate and taxied to the runway, Jordan kept his eyes on every switch, every movement, every choice Hayes made. And he took mental notes. The flight itself was uneventful until they began their descent into Phoenix. Jordan had been monitoring the radio frequencies when he noticed something wrong. Hayes, in his overconfidence, had entered the wrong frequency for air traffic control. That meant Phoenix's control tower couldn't properly transmit real-time wind direction and landing conditions, an error that could lead to a disaster in unstable weather. Jordan's pulse quickened. He immediately turned to his captain. "Captain Hayes, the Phoenix control tower frequency isn't 124.75, it's 112.8. For the first time that flight, Hayes actually hesitated. He frowned, glancing at the control panel. And then he realized Jordan was right. Without a word, Hayes quietly corrected the frequency, just as the tower's urgent call came through. The cockpit was silent for a moment. Both men knew what had just happened. If Jordan hadn't spoken up, they could have lost contact with air traffic control at a critical moment. And if that had happened, the consequences could have been catastrophic. Hayes said nothing. but Jordan could see it. The tension in the captain's posture, the way his fingers gripped the controls just a little too tight. A mistake like that, one made by a senior captain, was something Hayes would never forgive himself for. They landed smoothly in Phoenix, taxiing to the gate without further issues. And then, finally, Hayes spoke. Not an apology, not a thank you. Just 2 words, not bad. Jordan unbuckled his seatbelt, gathering his flight documents. He could already sense what was coming next. And he wasn't wrong. As they prepared to leave the cockpit, Hayes turned toward him, his voice low but firm. You'll never be a real captain at Titan Airways. Jordan didn't flinch. He had seen this coming from the moment he walked into the cockpit. Instead, he met Hayes's stare with calm, steady defiance. You're right about one thing, Jordan said smoothly. I won't become a captain the way you want me to. But I won't stop just because you try to block my way. Hayes's lip curled slightly, but there was something new in his eyes now. Was it discomfort? Impatience? Or maybe, just maybe, a flicker of doubt? Without another word, Jordan turned and stepped out of the cockpit, leaving behind an atmosphere so thick with tension, it could have been cut with a blade. As Jordan entered the Titan Airways pilot lounge, he could still feel the weight of the last few hours pressing down on him. The silence of his colleagues, the condescension of his captain, the thinly veiled threats woven into every interaction. He was still lost in thought when a quiet voice spoke from behind him. You're not the first captain to be treated like this. Jordan turned sharply. Standing near the doorway was Daniel Wu, a young pilot with sharp, intelligent eyes. Jordan narrowed his gaze. What do you mean? Daniel glanced around the room as if making sure no one else was listening before stepping closer. In the past 3 years, I've seen at least 4 new captains get kicked off their first flight without any explanation. Jordan's stomach tightened. Who were they? Daniel exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. 3 of them were black. The 4th was a woman. Jordan's jaw clenched. And what happened to them? Daniel hesitated before answering. 2 of them left for other airlines. 1 was permanently reassigned to short-haul domestic routes. The last one, he paused. He filed a complaint. A few months later, his name disappeared from the pilot roster. No one knows what happened to him. A slow, simmering anger rose in Jordan's chest. He had suspected this wasn't just about him. Now he had confirmation. This wasn't a one-time incident. It was a system, a pattern, a deliberate effort to keep certain people out of power. And now he had a choice. Would he walk away like the others, or would he fight back? Jordan already knew his answer. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Jordan Carter stood near the large terminal window, his eyes locked onto the Titan Airways planes lined up for takeoff. The engines roared in the distance, their powerful hum vibrating through the glass. Behind him, Daniel Wu leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching him closely. What are you going to do? Daniel asked. Jordan didn't answer immediately, because the truth was, he already knew. He couldn't let this go. He wouldn't be like the others, pilots who had been quietly pushed out, reassigned, or erased from the system. I don't know yet, he said finally, keeping his voice neutral. But deep down, he had already decided. Daniel sighed, lowering his voice. Someone tried to expose the truth before. He's not working here anymore. Jordan stiffened. That familiar, suffocating weight returned, the same feeling he had since being pulled from his first flight. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a system, a process designed to exclude people who didn't fit the standards that Titan Airways had silently put in place. Jordan didn't respond right away. He only nodded, acknowledging Daniel's words. But inside, he was already moving. There was only one question left. What else were they hiding besides discrimination? Later that night, as Hudson Gateway Airport grew quieter, Jordan made his way toward the maintenance area. It wasn't a place pilots usually went, but he had a reason to be here. Under the harsh white lights, a man stood near the open engine of a Titan Airways Boeing 737, inspecting with an experienced eye. He was in his late 50s, his dark skin worn by years of labor, his hands calloused and stained with oil. Samuel Graves, a veteran maintenance technician who had spent more years around airplanes than most pilots had spent flying them. When he saw Jordan approaching, he didn't seem surprised. He simply nodded, as if he had been expecting this meeting. You're not the first person to get kicked off their first flight, Samuel said, not bothering with introductions. Jordan wasn't surprised by the bluntness. Men like Samuel didn't waste words. If he was speaking, it meant he had something worth listening to. Jordan folded his arms. I know. A beat of silence, then Jordan pressed further. But this isn't just about discrimination, is it? Samuel sighed. He set down his rag, wiped his hands on his coveralls, then met Jordan's gaze. Titan Airways doesn't just have a problem with you. They're hiding something much bigger. Jordan felt a chill run through him. What do you mean? Samuel glanced around, lowering his voice. Have you ever heard of Raymond Holt? Jordan frowned. No. Samuel let out a breath, shaking his head. I figured. They erased him. Jordan's pulse quickened. Who was he? Samuel looked Jordan in the eye. One of the best maintenance engineers I've ever known. Worked here for over 20 years. And that's exactly why they got rid of him. Samuel leaned against the engine, his voice lowering even further. Raymond was the kind of guy who never missed a single detail. If there was a loose screw, a minor crack, anything, he'd catch it. And 3 years ago, he found something he wasn't supposed to. Jordan held his breath. Samuel's voice turned grim. A flaw in the cabin pressure valve system. Jordan's stomach dropped. What kind of flaw? One that could cause sudden pressure loss mid-flight. Samuel's eyes darkened. If not fixed properly, it could make everyone on board pass out in minutes. Pilots, crew, passengers, everyone. Jordan's fingers tightened around the edge of a tool cart. This wasn't just a minor maintenance issue. This was a potential catastrophe. Hundreds of people could die. Did he report it? Jordan asked. Samuel let out a bitter laugh. Oh, he tried. Jordan's heart pounded. What happened? Samuel's expression hardened. The report never made it to the FAA. Jordan stared at him. It disappeared? Samuel nodded. Blocked. Buried. Like it never existed. Jordan felt a cold. And what happened to Holt? This time Samuel hesitated. Then quietly he said, 3 weeks later, he had an accident. Jordan's blood turned to ice. What kind of accident? Samuel clenched his fists. He fell from a maintenance platform, over 20 feet. Jordan felt his breath hitch. Survived? Samuel nodded slowly. Barely. Broke both legs, crushed his spine. He hasn't walked since. Jordan exhaled sharply, struggling to contain his anger. And Titan Airways called it a personal error, didn't they? Samuel's jaw tightened. Said he didn't follow safety procedures. And after the accident, Samuel's voice was heavy. They fired him. No compensation, no mention of his report. He just disappeared. Jordan's heart pounded. This wasn't just about keeping certain pilots out of the captain's seat. This was about covering up a life-threatening defect and silencing anyone who tried to stop it. Jordan took a slow, deep breath, his thoughts racing. What about the planes with the faulty pressure valves? Samuel looked at him grimly. They're still flying. Jordan's stomach twisted. How many? Samuel sighed, rubbing his forehead. Not just one. Not just 10. Dozens. Jordan felt a wave of horror wash over him. If what Samuel was saying was true, then every single day, Titan Airways was sending passengers into the sky on planes that could fail at any moment. His hands curled into fists. Do you have proof? Samuel didn't answer right away. Then, after a long moment, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. He pressed it into Jordan's hand. This is part of it. Maintenance logs, flagged reports, discrepancies. Not everything, but enough to prove something's being covered up. Jordan stared at the USB drive in his palm. It felt heavier than anything he had ever held. Be careful, Samuel warned. If they catch you with this, I don't know what they'll do. Jordan looked up, meeting Samuel's gaze. His voice was steady. Then I won't let them catch me. Jordan Carter stood in the dimly lit maintenance hangar, the cold air carrying the faint scent of jet fuel and engine oil. In his hand he held a small USB drive, but it might as well have been a loaded weapon. Samuel Graves had just handed it to him, his expression grim. This is part of it, Samuel had said. Not everything, but enough to prove they're covering something up. Jordan stared at the device, feeling its weight pressed down on his palm like lead. This wasn't just about his career anymore. This was about lives. He looked up at Samuel. Thank you. Samuel gave a slow nod. Be careful. You've been noticed, Carter. Jordan's jaw tightened. I figured. Samuel exhaled, running a hand over his oil-streaked face. If you plan to go all the way with this, be prepared. Jordan didn't reply right away, because he already knew. There was no turning back. Jordan walked out of the maintenance area, slipping the USB into his jacket pocket, keeping his movements casual, as if nothing had changed. But inside, a storm was brewing. The revelation was bigger than he imagined. This wasn't just about keeping him out of the captain's seat. Titan Airways was hiding a fundamental, life-threatening safety issue. And if they had silenced Raymond Holt, they wouldn't hesitate to do the same to him. Jordan knew he couldn't move recklessly, so he made a decision. He would play the part of a man who had given up. In the days that followed, Jordan showed up at Titan Airways headquarters as usual. He didn't act suspicious. He took his assignments without complaint. They gave him short-haul, low-priority domestic routes, flights that no ambitious pilot wanted. It was a test. They were waiting for him to get frustrated and leave on his own. But Jordan didn't react. He needed time. Every time he checked a plane before takeoff, he recorded its flight number and compared it to the data Samuel had provided. And soon, a pattern emerged. Planes that had been flagged for serious technical issues, still flying. Maintenance reports, altered. Inspection records, tampered with. Major faults, downgraded to minor concerns. Mandatory safety checks, marked as complete even when they hadn't been done. It was a massive cover-up, and every flight that left the ground was a potential disaster waiting to happen. Jordan knew Samuel wasn't the only one with information, so he reached out. One evening, while sitting in the crew lounge, his phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. "I have something. If you're serious about this, meet me at the third-floor cafe at 10 p.m. Jordan didn't need to guess who it was. Naomi Rise. Samuel had mentioned her before. She was a senior flight attendant, known for standing up for her crew, known for reporting safety violations, even when it made her a target. And now she had reached out to him. At exactly 10 p.m., Jordan sat at a small table in the back of the cafe. Naomi Reyes arrived on time, slipping into the seat across from him. She was in her mid-30s, with sharp eyes that had seen too much. Without a word, she slid her phone across the table. Jordan picked it up and looked at the screen. A photo. His stomach dropped. The image showed the interior of a Titan Airways plane. A clear, jagged crack in the ceiling, right near the emergency exit. Jordan's voice was low. "When was this taken?" Naomi's expression was unreadable. "Last month, Flight 336 to Toronto." Jordan's grip on the phone tightened. A structural failure. Mid-air, this crack could lead to a total cabin decompression. Jordan exhaled. "Did you report it?" Naomi let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Of course we did." Jordan knew the answer before he even asked the next question. "And what did they do?" Her eyes burned with anger. "They told us to erase the report from the system and move on." Jordan felt his pulse quicken. "That plane, it flew again?" Naomi's jaw clenched. Less than 3 hours later. Jordan leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of it all settle in. It was one thing to suspect a cover-up. It was another to have undeniable proof. Raymond Holt had found a fatal mechanical flaw and was silenced. Samuel Graves had tracked altered maintenance reports, proving Titan Airways was falsifying safety data. Naomi Reyes had caught visual evidence of a structural failure on a plane that had been cleared to fly anyway. Jordan closed his eyes for a brief second. This wasn't just corporate negligence. This was willful, calculated, criminal endangerment. Naomi's voice cut through his thoughts. "You're planning to go all the way with this, aren't you?" Jordan opened his eyes. He didn't hesitate. "Yes." Naomi studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Then you need to be ready for what comes next." Jordan took a deep breath. "I already am." As he left the cafe, Jordan knew what had to happen next. He had the evidence. But exposing Titan Airways wouldn't be as simple as just handing over a USB drive. If they had covered up this much, they had powerful people protecting them. If he rushed this, he'd disappear before anyone could hear the truth. No, he had to be smarter. He had to go bigger. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about thousands of passengers, pilots, and crew members who didn't know they were stepping onto a flying death trap. And he wasn't going to let that happen. Jordan had made his choice, and Titan Airways had no idea what was coming for them. Jordan Carter felt the rage simmering inside him. This wasn't just neglect. Titan Airways wasn't just ignoring safety concerns. They were deliberately covering them up. Every piece of information he gathered painted a darker picture. Samuel Graves had exposed the falsified maintenance records. Naomi Reyes had shown him a crack in an aircraft's ceiling, dismissed by management. Raymond Holt had tried to blow the whistle and had been silenced. And now, they knew Jordan was onto them. At first it was small things. His internal emails were suddenly being monitored, something that had never happened before. An unfamiliar IT employee appeared in the pilot's office, casually checking computers. Leonard Hayes, who had barely spoken to Jordan before, now seemed more irritable, more watchful. And then one day, while inspecting a plane before takeoff, Jordan noticed something that made his skin crawl. A man. Standing at a distance. Watching him. He wasn't a pilot. He wasn't a technician. And when Jordan took a step toward him, the man turned and left without a word. That's when Jordan knew. He wasn't just fighting for the truth anymore. He was fighting to stay ahead of the people who wanted to bury it. That night, Jordan returned to his small apartment, locking the door behind him. He placed Samuel's USB drive on the table, opened his laptop, and started going through everything he had collected. The deeper he dug, the clearer the truth became. This wasn't just a small cover-up. Titan Airways had created an entire fake maintenance system. Planes marked unsafe were still flying. Inspection dates had been altered. Major faults had been downgraded to minor issues. Mandatory maintenance had been skipped entirely. This wasn't a mistake. This was a system. A system that put thousands of lives at risk every single day. Jordan exhaled, staring at the data on his screen. If he stopped now, he'd be part of the silence. And he couldn't do that. The next morning, Jordan arrived at Houston International Airport, preparing for a routine flight to San Diego. He went through the pre-flight checklist, his hands moving automatically, until he saw something that made his pulse quicken. The maintenance log for the Boeing 737 he was about to pilot claimed that the cabin pressure control valves had been inspected just 2 days ago. But when Jordan cross-checked the serial numbers with the data Samuel had given him, there was no record of any inspection. And worse, this exact aircraft had previously been flagged for structural defects. Jordan clenched the file in his hands. This was it, a choice. Either turn a blind eye like everyone else, or take action, no matter the consequences. His voice was calm when he made the call. I need the maintenance crew here immediately for a full inspection. The response was immediate chaos. The flight, scheduled for 6:45 p.m., was still grounded by 7:05 p.m. Warning lights on the internal system started flashing as maintenance teams ran manual checks. Passengers grew anxious. Flight attendants looked confused. The coordination team kept calling for updates, demanding explanations. In the cockpit, Daniel Wu, Jordan's co-pilot, leaned in. Are you sure about this? Daniel whispered. Jordan didn't hesitate. I'm sure. The delay stretched for 20 minutes. Then a technician stepped into the cockpit, his face pale. Captain Carter, you were right. Jordan turned to him. The pressure valve? The technician nodded. It wasn't just unchecked, it was damaged. If you hadn't flagged this, we could have had a total loss of cabin pressure at 30,000 feet. A disaster. Jordan felt a slow burn of satisfaction mixed with rage. They fixed the issue immediately. The flight finally took off, safely. But Jordan knew Titan Airways wasn't going to let this slide. 3 hours later, Jordan sat in a small, dimly lit meeting room inside Titan Airways' operations center. Across the table from him stood Charles Whitman, CEO of Titan Airways. His arms were crossed. His face was expressionless, but his eyes burned with anger. Jordan had forced their hand, and he knew exactly why he was here. Whitman exhaled, his voice razor sharp. Do you have any idea how much your decision just cost us? Jordan didn't blink. A 20-minute delay is nothing compared to a plane full of unconscious passengers at 30,000 feet. Whitman's expression darkened. That's not your call to make. Jordan leaned forward. It is when I'm in the captain's seat. Silence. A long, heavy silence. Whitman's fingers drummed against the table. Then finally he spoke. This is a warning, Carter. Next time you delay a flight without valid reason, I won't hesitate to fire you. Jordan didn't look away. You call ignoring a critical failure a valid reason? Whitman smirked, but there was no humor in his expression. You think you're doing the right thing, don't you? Jordan's voice was calm. I know I am. Whitman's smirk faded. Then we'll see how long you last. He stood, signaling that the meeting was over. Jordan slowly got up, buttoning his uniform. Before leaving, he met Whitman's gaze one last time. "No, Mr. Whitman. We'll see how long you last." And with that, he walked out. He knew this wasn't over. But now, Titan Airways knew he wasn't going down without a fight. Jordan Carter stood his ground, his gaze locked onto Charles Whitman, the CEO of Titan Airways. Across the dimly lit conference room, Whitman's expression was a mix of anger and cold calculation. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the polished wooden table, his posture rigid with barely contained frustration. "A 20-minute delay," Whitman spat, his voice sharp with irritation. "Do you realize how much that cost us?" Jordan didn't flinch. The only mistake made today was allowing a plane with a critical failure to take off without inspection. Whitman leaned forward, both hands flat on the desk. "Listen to me, Carter. At Titan Airways, we operate on two principles: reliability and efficiency. If every pilot acted like you, our entire system would collapse." Jordan narrowed his eyes. "If your system depends on putting passengers at risk, then maybe it should collapse." Whitman sneered, a slow, condescending smirk forming on his face. "You're ruining your career, Carter. This is your first and final warning. If you delay another flight without a valid reason, I won't hesitate to fire you." Jordan didn't blink. A 20-minute delay is nothing compared to losing 100 lives at 30,000 feet. A tense silence filled the room. Finally, Whitman stood, adjusting his tie. His voice was lower now, but more menacing. "We'll see how long you can resist this system." Jordan calmly buttoned his uniform jacket and met Whitman's gaze with unwavering defiance. "We'll see." Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. This wasn't the end of the fight. This was just the beginning. As Jordan stepped out of Whitman's office, he could feel the shift around him. The air was heavier. Colleagues who once exchanged casual conversations now avoided eye contact. Some pilots turned away as he walked past, pretending not to see him. Others subtly stepped back, distancing themselves from whatever storm he had just unleashed. Jordan had officially become a problem. But he didn't care. What he cared about was what came next. That evening, he returned to his small apartment, tossing his flight bag onto the table before pouring himself a glass of water. Just as he lifted it to his lips, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. He glanced at the screen, and his blood ran cold. "Stop, or you'll end up like Raymond Holt." Jordan stared at the words, his grip tightening around the phone. He didn't need to read it twice. This wasn't a warning. This was a threat. Jordan exhaled slowly, keeping his emotions in check. Without responding, he calmly locked his phone screen, removed the SIM card, and dropped it into a glass of water. The message didn't scare him, but it confirmed something important. They were watching him, and they wanted him to know it. He walked to the window, carefully pulling back the curtain just enough to see outside. A black car sat parked across the street. The engine was still running. No one got in. No one got out. It was just there, waiting. Jordan stared at it for a few seconds before making his decision. He let the curtain fall back into place and walked away. If they thought they could scare him into silence, they had miscalculated. The next morning, Jordan walked into Titan Airways' Flight Operations Center. The moment he entered, he felt it, the shift. Eyes followed him, some filled with curiosity, others with caution, a few with undisguised hostility. Even the polite nods from fellow pilots felt different, like they knew something he didn't. Jordan kept his expression neutral as he approached a computer terminal to check his flight schedule. But the moment he logged in, a strange message appeared on the screen. "Your account is being monitored. All system activity will be recorded." Jordan sat up straighter. That was new. He tried accessing his flight schedule. Everything seemed normal. Then, he navigated to the maintenance logs. A warning screen flashed red. Access denied. Jordan's pulse quickened. They had locked him out. For the first time since this started, Titan Airways had taken direct action against him. Jordan exhaled, forcing himself to remain calm. This wasn't unexpected. If anything, it only proved what he already knew. Titan Airways was willing to do whatever it took to bury the truth. But if they thought blocking his access would stop him, they were dead wrong. This was no longer just about his career. This was about thousands of lives. And Jordan Carter wasn't going to back down. No matter the cost. They weren't just trying to scare him anymore. They were shutting him out. Jordan Carter sat at his desk in the Flight Operations Center, staring at the error message on his screen. Access denied. Your system activity is being monitored. His stomach tightened, but he forced himself to keep his expression neutral. Across the room, a man in a white shirt, no pilot badge, no maintenance ID, walked past the rows of desks. He didn't stop. He didn't speak, but he made eye contact with Jordan, just for a split second, and then he was gone. Jordan exhaled slowly. They were watching him, officially. As he changed into his uniform in the pilot's lounge, he felt the tension in the air. The way conversations hushed when he walked by, the side glances. Then, a voice came from behind him. Don't trust anyone, they're watching you. Jordan turned. Standing in the doorway was Eric Dawson, a young pilot he had spoken to only a few times before. His expression was tense. Jordan studied him for a moment. Why are you telling me this? Eric glanced toward the hallway, then stepped closer, lowering his voice. I've worked here for 3 years. I've seen what they do to people who question the system. Jordan felt a sinking feeling in his gut. What exactly have they done? Eric hesitated, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. They don't always fire them right away. Sometimes they just make life miserable until the person quits. Jordan frowned. And if they don't quit, Eric exhaled, then worse. Jordan's pulse slowed. Worse? Eric shifted uneasily, as if saying it out loud would make it more real. Raymond Holt wasn't the only one. Jordan's stomach tightened further. Who else? Eric hesitated, then looked away. I don't remember his name, but a maintenance engineer about a year ago found an issue with the navigation system on some of the older planes. Did he report it? Eric nodded. Yeah, he submitted the paperwork, did everything by the book. Jordan already knew the answer before he asked. And what happened? Eric's voice dropped to a whisper. Less than a month later, he died in a car accident on his way to work. Jordan's hands clenched into fists. The police ruled it an accident, Eric continued, said he lost control of the car, but there were too many things that didn't add up. Jordan's mind raced. Titan Airways wasn't just covering up maintenance failures, they were eliminating threats. Eric's voice softened. I know what you're doing, Carter, and if you're not careful. Jordan met his gaze. Eric didn't have to finish the sentence. Jordan already knew. He would be next. Jordan's next flight was uneventful until he stepped into the cockpit. As he powered up the main control panel, his eyes immediately caught something off. The cabin pressure warning system had been temporarily disabled. Jordan's pulse quickened. This wasn't a mistake. Someone had done this on purpose. He called for maintenance. A few minutes later, a technician arrived. The man looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight as he checked the system. It's fine now, Captain Carter. Must have been a glitch. It's back online. Jordan stared at him. Who disabled it? The technician froze for just a second too long. Then he forced a smile. There are no records of that, sir. Jordan didn't believe him. But he didn't push further. He just nodded and turned back to his seat. Inside, he was seething. They were sending him a message, a reminder that they could reach into his cockpit, into the very place where he had control, and take it away. If they were ready to play at this level, then so was he. That night, Jordan sat in his apartment, his gaze fixed on the glowing laptop screen. Dozens of maintenance fraud documents were neatly organized in front of him. The falsified reports from Samuel Graves, the ignored safety violations from Naomi Reyes, the tampered aircraft logs, the corporate cover-ups, the threats, the warnings. Titan Airways wasn't just reckless. They were playing with lives, and they knew it. Jordan had gone too far to turn back now. The warning from Eric, the black car watching his apartment, the tampered cockpit system. It was all connected. They knew he was trying to expose them, and if he didn't act first, they'd eliminate him, just like they had with the others. Jordan stared at his phone for a long moment. Then he scrolled through his contacts, stopping on a name he had saved but never thought he'd have to call. Olivia Carter, his sister, and one of the best corporate lawyers in the country. Jordan exhaled, then decisively hit the call button. After 3 rings, she answered. This is Olivia. What's going on? Jordan closed his eyes briefly. Then, his voice steady, he said, I need your help to bring something to light. Jordan Carter took a deep breath before speaking. I need your help to bring this to light. His sister, Olivia Carter, was silent on the other end of the line. She wasn't just his sibling, she was a high-profile corporate attorney, someone who had taken down multi-billion-dollar companies in legal battles. But even she had never expected her own brother to be the one calling for help. Jordan didn't hold back. He told her everything, from being pulled off his first flight, to the rigged maintenance system, the threats, the falsified safety records, the tampered aircraft, and finally, the overwhelming evidence he had gathered. By the time he finished, Olivia was silent. Jordan waited. Then finally, her voice came through, calm but full of concern. "Do you realize that if you go through with this, your career is over?" Jordan let out a bitter laugh. "Do you think I still have a career after everything that's happened? They're just waiting for the right moment to push me out." A long pause. Then Olivia asked the only question that mattered. "What do you want to do?" Jordan's grip on his phone tightened. "I need you to connect me with a reliable investigative reporter, someone who can break this story before they silence it. And I also need to contact the FAA immediately." Olivia let out a slow breath. Then, her tone became resolute. "All right, I'll handle it." 2 days later, Jordan walked into a small cafe in downtown Denver, a thick folder tucked under his arm. This was where he was set to meet Rebecca Lane, a top investigative journalist from the Denver Chronicle. She had a reputation for exposing corporate corruption and making powerful enemies in the process. Jordan spotted her the moment she entered, a tall woman in her late 40s, her sharp gaze sweeping across the cafe like she was already gathering intel. She walked up to his table, set down her briefcase, and spoke without pretense. "Let's get straight to it. What do you have for me?" Jordan slid the stack of documents across the table. Rebecca opened the folder, flipping through maintenance records, flight logs, internal emails, and falsified safety reports. Her expression remained unreadable until she got to the photos from Naomi Reyes. The cracked ceiling panel near the emergency exit. Rebecca's lips pressed into a thin line. She grabbed a pen, taking quick notes before looking up. "How sure are you that this data is accurate?" Jordan didn't hesitate. 100%. "And if you need more, I can provide witnesses." Rebecca studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded, closing the folder. "All right. But I need to verify everything before I publish. I'll be contacting the FAA for independent confirmation." Her gaze darkened. "If what you're saying is true, we're looking at one of the biggest aviation scandals in history." Jordan tightened his fingers around his coffee cup. "How long can you keep my identity a secret?" Rebecca smirked. "Do you really think you have a secret identity, Carter?" Jordan's pulse slowed. Rebecca leaned forward slightly. "If I have these documents, that means someone inside Titan Airways already knows what you're doing. The real question isn't whether they'll come after you, it's what they'll do next." Jordan exhaled slowly. He already knew the answer. At the same time, an official report was sent to the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration. Jordan knew that an anonymous letter wouldn't be enough. He needed this to be big. Big enough that the FAA had no choice but to act. He compiled everything. The falsified maintenance reports from Samuel Graves, the deliberately ignored safety violations from Naomi Reyes, the patterns of technical failures across multiple aircraft, the testimonies of engineers and crew members. When he hit send, he felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders. A part of him expected relief. Instead, an unsettling feeling crept in. Titan Airways wasn't going to let this go. And 3 days later, his fears were confirmed. The first front-page article from the Denver Chronicle hit the newsstands with a headline that sent shockwaves through the industry. Titan Airways faces serious safety violations. Insider whistleblower reveals systematic cover-up. Jordan's name wasn't mentioned, but the details were clear enough for anyone inside the company to know exactly who had leaked the information. The evidence published was only a fraction of what he had provided, just enough to pressure the FAA into launching a formal investigation. Jordan sat in the crew lounge, his hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee, as pilots and flight attendants whispered around him. The energy had changed. Some people were angry. Others were terrified, but everyone knew. Titan Airways was officially in trouble, and then the phone rang. A landline, the break room's old wall-mounted phone. Jordan knew before he even picked it up. He lifted the receiver to his ear. A low, cold voice came through the line. "We need to talk, Carter, right now." Jordan didn't need to ask who it was. They had found him, and the real fight was just beginning. Jordan Carter had never felt so alone. He walked into the pilot's lounge, feeling the air shift the moment he stepped inside. Conversations stopped. Colleagues who had once greeted him warmly now turned away, pretending they hadn't seen him. The few who glanced in his direction quickly looked down, as if afraid that merely acknowledging him would bring them trouble. Jordan wasn't surprised. Titan Airways was closing in. That morning, his company phone buzzed with a message. Report immediately to the executive meeting room on the 12th floor. Do not be late. Jordan stared at the screen, his palm tightening unconsciously around the device. They weren't going to let him walk away so easily. The moment Jordan stepped into the executive meeting room, he knew what this was. An ambush. The air inside was heavy as lead. A long, glass-topped table reflected the harsh fluorescent lights above, creating an almost sterile coldness in the room. Sitting in the center was Charles Whitman, the CEO of Titan Airways, his face unreadable. To his left sat Leonard Hayes, his second-in-command, wearing an expression of quiet amusement. And in the far corner, Martin Caldwell stood with his arms crossed, his sharp gaze cutting through Jordan like a blade. A seat had been pulled out for him. But Jordan didn't sit down. Whitman slowly pushed a stack of documents forward, his dull gray eyes never leaving Jordan's face. Let's get straight to the point. His voice was sharp, precise, like a scalpel poised to cut. You've damaged Titan Airways' reputation. We're now under FAA investigation. Our stock value is at risk. However, he nudged the documents closer. We're willing to settle this quietly. Jordan's gaze dropped to the first page. A non-disclosure agreement. If he signed it, he would receive a generous settlement, but in return he would be legally bound to never speak about Titan Airways again. Whitman leaned back, watching him carefully. Sign it, Carter. Walk away quietly, or we'll have to take stronger measures. Jordan slowly exhaled, then slid the documents back across the table. I didn't come here to sign anything. Whitman's smirk didn't fade, but his eyes sharpened. Do you understand what's happening here, Carter? His voice lowered, turning colder. The FAA is watching you. The media is circling. But let me tell you something. Nobody cares about these allegations in the long run. You have nothing but incomplete reports, some vague statements from low-level employees, and you're up against a multi-billion-dollar airline. Do you really think you can win? Jordan held his gaze. I don't need to win, Whitman. He leaned forward, his voice steady. I just need the truth to be exposed. Across the table, Leonard Hayes chuckled softly, shaking his head. The truth, he mused, his tone dripping with condescension. Carter, you're naive. Look at what's happened to those before you. Do you really think you're the exception? Jordan didn't flinch. He placed both hands on the table, his voice firm. The FAA has full evidence. The press has the internal documents, and I have enough witnesses ready to testify in court. He let the weight of his words settle over the room. If Titan Airways doesn't act now, the truth will explode before the public. Silence. A suffocating silence. Whitman's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. His calm demeanor fractured for just a second before his jaw clenched. The company lawyers exchanged uncertain glances, as if they had underestimated how far Jordan had gone. Then, Martin Caldwell stood up. He planted both hands on the table, leaning forward. Do you think the FAA will do anything? Investigations take years. Meanwhile, we'll still be operating. We'll still be here. And you? His lips curled into a slow, mocking smile. Do you think any airline will hire a traitor like you? Jordan didn't answer immediately. He just stared at Caldwell, long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable. Then, in a voice steady as stone, he said, You know what's funny, Caldwell? He leaned in slightly. I don't care about my career anymore. Caldwell's smirk faltered slightly. Jordan continued, But I do know one thing. You do. A flicker of uncertainty passed through Caldwell's eyes. And that's when Whitman spoke again, his voice lower, more menacing. Fine, Carter. His tone had changed. It wasn't dismissive anymore. It was deadly. If you want a war, you'll have it. But I promise you, when this is over, you'll have nothing left. Jordan smiled. A slow, deliberate smile. We'll see who loses more, Mr. Whitman. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the room. As Jordan stepped out of the executive offices, he knew. He had just crossed a line. There was no turning back. Behind that closed door, the people running Titan Airways were scrambling, desperate to keep their empire from collapsing. But the truth? It was already too late. Because at that very moment, as Whitman and his executives planned their next move, the FAA was preparing their own. Titan Airways is immediately suspended. The words echoed in Jordan Carter's mind as he stepped out of the executive meeting room, the weight of the moment pressing down on his shoulders. The hallways were silent, yet the air was charged with unspoken tension. No one said a word. No one needed to. Jordan had just struck the final blow, but he wasn't naive enough to think this was the end. The people in power wouldn't go down without a fight, but neither would he. The next morning, as Jordan rolled out of bed, he reached for his phone and froze. A bold, glaring headline stared back at him from every major news website. FAA launches emergency investigation into Titan Airways. Dozens of flights affected. It had begun. Major media outlets were now reporting on the scandal. Below the article, comments flooded in by the thousands. Passengers, pilots, and airline staff all weighing in. Titan Airways' booking system crashed under an avalanche of refund requests and cancellations. Videos of angry passengers stranded at airports, suitcases in hand, demanding answers, flooded social media. One of the largest airlines in the country was spiraling into full-blown crisis, and Jordan had set it in motion. The FAA wasted no time. Within 48 hours of the investigation's launch, 40% of Titan Airways' fleet was grounded for immediate safety inspections. Federal inspectors flooded the maintenance hangars, scrutinizing every aircraft, every report, every bolt. Internal audits exposed widespread fraud. What they found was worse than even Jordan had imagined. For years, Titan Airways had been operating a fake maintenance system. Inspection reports had been falsified. Old, unsafe planes had been disguised as airworthy. Critical components, cabin pressure valves, fuel control systems, landing sensors, had been replaced with cheap, unapproved parts. It wasn't just negligence, it was criminal. The scandals spread like wildfire. CNN, the New York Times, BBC. Every major news outlet ran the same narrative, one of the most serious aviation safety violations of the past decade. Panic set in. Thousands of passengers were stranded at airports, confused, scared, and furious. Titan Airways customer service lines were overwhelmed. Angry crowds gathered at help desks, demanding answers from confused employees who had none to give. And then, the company's stock plummeted. Within days, Titan Airways lost billions in market value. But the worst was yet to come. 3 days later, the inevitable happened. The leadership of Titan Airways was summoned for an emergency hearing with the U.S. Department of Transportation. Jordan sat in the pilot's lounge, watching the live press conference on the overhead TV. A stern-faced FAA spokesperson stepped up to the podium. He unfolded a sheet of paper, cleared his throat, and began to read. After a thorough examination, we have discovered numerous serious violations in Titan Airways' maintenance system. These actions not only violate federal aviation regulations, but also endanger the lives of millions of passengers. As a result, effective immediately, the FAA is suspending all operations of Titan Airways until the final results of the investigation are concluded. Furthermore, we will be working closely with the Department of Justice to determine the criminal liability of those involved. The room fell silent. Jordan exhaled, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. It was over. Whitman, Hayes, Caldwell, and countless other executives who had upheld the system were immediately fired. But it didn't stop there. Within a week, they received federal subpoenas. The U.S. Department of Justice officially charged them with fraud, falsifying maintenance documents, deliberately concealing safety violations. For the first time in history, a major airline was facing criminal prosecution, and those who had built their empire on lies would finally be held accountable. Jordan didn't feel joy, he didn't feel triumph. He only felt relief. Not because he had won, but because finally, passengers wouldn't have to gamble with their lives every time they stepped onto a Titan Airways plane. The battle was over, but the war for truth had only just begun. 3 months had passed. Jordan Carter sat on a bench at Denver International Airport, watching as workers dismantled the last remnants of Titan Airways' presence. The once familiar logo was being taken down, replaced by the bold lettering of a new name, Horizon Aviation, the airline that had acquired Titan Airways' assets after its bankruptcy. Behind him, a familiar voice broke the silence. "You still want to keep flying?" Jordan turned to see Daniel Wu, a former colleague, standing with a knowing smile. "They're hiring pilots, and I hear you have quite an impressive resume." Jordan chuckled, standing up. For the first time in months, he didn't feel like he was carrying an invisible burden. "I'm not sure," he admitted, "but I think I'll consider it." The sky stretched out before him, vast and endless. But this time, as he thought about returning to it, he knew one thing. He would no longer be flying under the shadow of those willing to trade safety for profit. The aviation industry would never be the same again. Jordan sat quietly in the pilot's lounge, gazing through the large glass windows. Beyond them, planes took off and landed, their metallic wings catching the sunlight. The sky was still the same, but the industry had changed forever. The collapse of Titan Airways had not just marked the downfall of a once mighty airline, it had sent shockwaves throughout commercial aviation. Titan Airways had been one of the largest carriers in the United States, a name synonymous with stability and prestige. But now, that name was nothing more than a stain in history. A warning to all airlines: if you gamble with human lives, you will pay the price. When Horizon Aviation completed its acquisition of Titan Airways' assets, they did something unexpected. They transformed Titan Airways' former headquarters into a new training center for pilots and technicians. Titan Airways' legacy wasn't its reputation or its profits. It was a cautionary tale. A lesson etched into aviation history, one that would remind future generations of pilots and engineers what happens when safety is compromised for profit. The fall of Titan Airways had unleashed something bigger. The FAA, under pressure from the public and government, responded with unprecedented action. Stricter maintenance regulations were enforced across the industry. Airlines faced surprise inspections, with some smaller carriers even being grounded for violations. The U.S. Department of Transportation ordered a comprehensive review of all major commercial airlines within 6 months. But the most significant change? The creation of the National Aviation Safety Oversight Committee. For the first time in history, an independent regulatory body, free from corporate influence, was established to monitor airline safety, licensing, and maintenance procedures. Pilots, flight attendants, and technicians, who had once been silenced by fear, now had legal protections. Thanks to a whistleblower law passed by Congress, no airline could threaten or retaliate against those who reported safety concerns. The days of corporate cover-ups were over, but not everyone embraced the change so easily. In a federal courtroom in Washington, D.C., the once powerful figures of Titan Airways stood before the judge. Charles Whitman, Leonard Hayes, Martin Caldwell, and dozens of other executives. They faced a list of charges: fraud, falsifying maintenance records, intentionally concealing safety risks. The trial lasted for months, with a stream of former employees, pilots, and technicians taking the stand. Among them, Samuel Graves, the veteran maintenance technician, publicly exposed the system that forced engineers to falsify data just to keep planes flying. Naomi Reyes, the flight attendant, provided images and leaked emails proving that Titan Airways had ignored serious incident reports to avoid flight delays. And Eric Dawson, the young pilot who had first warned Jordan, testified that Titan Airways had tracked and threatened anyone who dared to speak out. The press covered every moment, amplifying the trial into a national spectacle. There was nowhere left for Titan Airways to hide. In the end, the judge delivered a historic ruling. Charles Whitman, the once untouchable CEO, was sentenced to 20 years in prison for fraud and willfully endangering human lives. Leonard Hayes and Martin Caldwell received lighter sentences but were permanently banned from ever working in aviation again. Their empire was gone, their power erased, and their legacy forever tarnished. Jordan Carter never stepped foot in that courtroom. He didn't need to. He had already done what needed to be done. Instead, he watched from a distance, knowing that the industry had finally changed. No airline would ever again get away with what Titan Airways had done, because now the skies were being watched. The men who once sat at the peak of power were now nothing but prisoners, their names forever tainted. Charles Whitman, Leonard Hayes, Martin Caldwell. They had ruled Titan Airways with absolute authority. They had believed they were untouchable. Now, they were permanently banned from the aviation industry. their careers, their legacies, all erased. Jordan Carter never set foot in the courtroom during their trial. He didn't need to. He had never wanted the spotlight, never wanted to be a hero. He had only wanted to ensure that something like Titan Airways could never happen again. 6 months after Titan Airways' bankruptcy, Jordan received an email. Subject: an opportunity at Horizon Aviation. Jordan, we'd love to have you as part of our team, not just as a captain, but also as a safety consultant. Your experience and knowledge could help us rebuild this industry the right way. Let us know if you're interested. He stared at the email for a long time. He still loved the sky, still longed for the feeling of piloting an aircraft, soaring through the clouds, but he also knew he could never go back to being just a pilot. The world had changed, and so had he. 1 year later, at the annual Aviation Safety Conference, hundreds of representatives from major airlines sat in the massive auditorium. The industry had changed, and now they were waiting to hear from the man who had changed it. Jordan stepped up to the podium, looking down at the audience. They expected him to talk about the past, but he wasn't here to talk about Titan Airways. He was here to talk about the future. His voice rang through the hall. We have an inescapable responsibility to ensure that no airline can gamble with human lives the way Titan Airways did. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Jordan continued, safety cannot be a choice, it must be an unbreakable rule. I'm not standing here to revisit what happened. I'm standing here to make sure it never happens again. Silence. Then applause. From the front row, he saw familiar faces: Naomi Reyes, Samuel Graves, Daniel Wu, Eric Dawson. The people who had stood by him when no one else would. They had sacrificed so much, and yet they had done what so few dared to do. The aviation industry would never be the same again, and that was their greatest victory. Months passed. Jordan stood by the window of his office, watching planes take off from Denver International Airport. The sky was the same, vast, endless, welcoming all those who dared to dream of reaching it. But his path had changed. Since the collapse of Titan Airways, Jordan had received countless offers. Airlines wanted him as a captain. Aviation safety organizations wanted him as an advisor. Flight schools wanted him as an instructor. But one offer stood above the rest. The FAA. A senior safety advisor position. A role where he could shape new regulations to ensure that what happened at Titan Airways could never happen again, where he could build a system where truth couldn't be hidden, where pilots and technicians could speak out without fear of being silenced. He accepted, and over the next year he worked on tightening safety standards, implementing independent inspection processes, ensuring that no one like Whitman, Hayes, or Caldwell could ever control an airline again. But no matter how far he went, the sky still called to him. One afternoon, as Jordan scrolled through his emails, he saw a familiar name. Daniel Wu. Subject: the captain's seat awaits. Jordan, Horizon Aviation is looking for an experienced captain to train the next generation of pilots. They want you. Are you interested? Jordan leaned back in his chair, thinking. He remembered the days spent in the cockpit, the feeling of the controls in his hands, the thrill of flying through the clouds, the unmatched responsibility of knowing that hundreds of lives depended on him. He clicked snooze on the email. He wasn't ready to decide, but for the first time in months, he felt a stir in his heart. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't done flying yet. That evening, when Jordan returned home, his phone buzzed. A new email notification. He glanced at the screen and froze. Sender: Leonard Hayes, the former executive of Titan Airways. Jordan hesitated for a moment. Then, slowly, he opened the email. It contained just 6 words. You were right, I'm sorry. No excuses, no justifications, just 6 words. Jordan sat quietly, staring at the screen. Leonard Hayes, once one of the staunchest defenders of Titan Airways' corruption, was now apologizing. It couldn't change the past, couldn't erase what had happened, but it meant one thing. People could change. Jordan's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then he typed a simple reply. Apology accepted. The sky belongs to all of us. He hit send. Outside his window, a plane took off, soaring into the endless sky. Jordan watched it, knowing the road ahead was still long. But whether he stayed with the FAA or returned to the cockpit, one thing was certain. The sky was now a safer place. And he had helped make that happen. Jordan Carter sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen. The numbers blinked before him, but his mind wasn't there. His gaze kept drifting back to the email in his inbox. The sender, Leonard Hayes, a man who had once stood at the top of Titan Airways defending its corruption and deception. Now his message contained only 6 words. "You were right, I'm sorry." No explanations, no excuses, just a simple admission of guilt. Jordan knew it couldn't change the past. It wouldn't erase what had happened. But it meant one thing. Even those who once upheld a broken system could recognize their mistakes. He took a breath and typed his reply. Apology accepted. The sky belongs to all of us. Then he hit send. Outside his window, a plane soared into the endless sky. And for the first time, Jordan felt that his fight had truly made a difference. It wasn't just about fixing the system. It was about changing the people within it. 7 months later, Jordan stepped into a large auditorium at the North American Flight Institute. Before him sat hundreds of young cadets, the future of commercial aviation. They weren't the ones who had witnessed the fall of Titan Airways, but they would be the ones who would inherit the industry after all the changes. He stepped up to the podium, exhaled, and began. "I didn't come here to talk about the past. I came here to talk about the future." A hush fell over the crowd. Pens scratched against notebooks as every cadet leaned in to listen. The aviation industry is not just a job, it's a promise. When a passenger steps onto your aircraft, they place their trust in you, not just as pilots, but as guardians of their lives. The weight of those words settled over the room. Jordan's voice grew firm. But there will come a day when you are tested. A day when the system asks you to look the other way. A day when someone in power tells you to ignore a problem, for profit, for time, for convenience. You let those words sink in before asking, and in that moment, you must ask yourself, who will you be? Someone who bows their head, or someone who stands up for what is right? His eyes swept across the room. No one will praise you for choosing the difficult path. There will be sacrifices. But the only thing that matters is this. When you sit in the captain's seat, can you be confident that you've done everything in your power to protect the people behind you? A beat of silence. Then applause. Not overly loud, but enough for him to know they had truly listened. As Jordan stepped down from the podium, a group of young pilots approached him. One of them, the young woman in a freshly pressed pilot uniform, spoke up. "You are the reason I pursued this career. Your story showed me that being a pilot isn't just a job, it's a mission." Jordan nodded, feeling a quiet pride swell within him. He had never sought fame or recognition. But if he could change the way a new generation of pilots thought, then he had truly made a difference. 3 months later, Jordan officially accepted an invitation to become a training advisor for major airlines. But he wasn't just teaching flying skills. He was teaching ethics, the responsibility of a pilot, the importance of never turning a blind eye to safety risks. He trained future captains, he guided air traffic controllers, he held workshops for maintenance engineers, helping them understand that their voices mattered. Most importantly, he didn't just impart knowledge. He instilled courage, integrity, and an uncompromising spirit toward wrongdoing. One day after finishing a class, Jordan's phone buzzed. A message from Daniel Wu. "Horizon Aviation is still waiting for you. If you want to return to the skies, the captain's seat is always yours." Jordan looked at his phone screen, then up at the vast sky above. For the longest time, he had believed he had to choose one path. Continue fighting within the system or return to the cockpit. But now he realized he didn't have to choose. He could do both. He could continue protecting the skies, not just through policy and regulation, but from inside the cockpit itself. He took a deep breath. The sky was still there, waiting for him. And this time, he would be flying in a world he had helped change. Jordan Carter picked up his phone. His fingers hovered for a moment before he pressed the reply button. "I'll be back." A simple message, but it carried the weight of years of struggle. Jordan stepped out of the Horizon Aviation Training Center, feeling the buzz of activity around him. Young pilots were still gathered, animatedly discussing the flight simulation scenarios he had presented. Looking at them, he knew. This new generation of aviators was being trained with a different mindset. A mindset that placed safety above all else. A mindset that never compromised under pressure from the system. What Jordan hadn't expected was that his story would go beyond the walls of the academy, beyond Horizon Aviation, beyond the United States. 2 years after the collapse of Titan Airways, an article appeared on the front page of the New York Times. From the Titan Airways scandal to global aviation reform, the pilot who changed everything. Jordan read the article during a transatlantic flight, feeling both distant and familiar. He had never wanted to be a symbol, but his story had become something bigger than himself. A testament to the cost of courage. Proof that one individual could stand up to a broken system and win. Airlines around the world had been forced to change. Public pressure, new FAA regulations, and international scrutiny had turned once impossible reforms into industry standards. The changes weren't just happening in the US. The FAA established an independent monitoring system, preventing airline executives from interfering with maintenance inspections. Whistleblower protection laws were strengthened, ensuring that pilots, maintenance engineers, and flight attendants could report violations without fear of retaliation. A new FAA safety committee was created, requiring all airlines to have an internal oversight department with the power to ground flights if any danger was detected. And beyond the US? The European Union Aviation Safety Agency, EASA, adopted similar measures, pushing for stricter international regulations. The International Civil Aviation Organization, AO, implemented new safety standards across global airlines. The aviation industry was no longer the same, and it had all started with one story. The story of a pilot who refused to remain silent. Jordan Carter had never liked being called a hero. He had only done what any pilot should do, ensure that every passenger who stepped onto a plane could land safely. But over time, he realized, his fight had become something bigger. One morning, as he prepared for a long-haul flight, a young pilot approached him. She had bright, determined eyes, her uniform crisp, the 4 gold stripes on her sleeve marking her as a newly promoted captain. "You're Jordan Carter, right?" Her voice was slightly hesitant but full of respect. Jordan nodded, a little surprised. "Yes, that's me. What's going on?" She smiled. "I just wanted to say, your story made me determined to pursue this career." Her words caught him off guard. She continued, "Before, I was afraid that if I saw something wrong, I wouldn't be able to speak up. But because of you, I know that the truth must always come first." Jordan looked into her eyes and saw a reflection of his younger self. Someone full of ambition. Someone who believed that the sky wasn't just a place to fly, but a place to fight for what's right. He smiled and extended his hand. "The sky belongs to all of us. Fly steady." She nodded, turned, and walked toward her aircraft, ready to take on the skies. Jordan stood there for a long moment. This was his legacy. Not in headlines, not in awards, but in the pilots he had helped inspire, those who would carry the fight forward. Jordan took a deep breath and walked toward his own cockpit. The flight was about to take off. But this time, he wasn't just a pilot. He was part of a change that would last forever. 5 years had passed. Jordan stood at the FAA headquarters, on a glass platform overlooking the airport below. Planes took off one after another, carrying thousands of passengers to destinations across the world. The people boarding those flights didn't know him. They didn't know the battles he had fought. But every safe flight that took off today was the result of what he and his team had worked to change. The aviation industry was no longer what it once was. Airlines could no longer bypass regulations. Maintenance reports couldn't be falsified. Pilots could speak the truth without fear. Everything Titan Airways had tried to hide was now etched into the history of aviation. It wasn't just about fixing a broken system. It was about ensuring that no airline would ever put lives at risk again. Jordan Carter had once been a pilot fighting against a corrupt industry. Now he was part of a global movement that had reshaped aviation safety forever. The aviation industry was no longer what it once was. New safety regulations had been enforced. Airlines could no longer falsify maintenance reports or bypass inspections. Pilots no longer feared speaking out against safety violations. What Titan Airways had once hidden was now part of the mandatory training programs of airlines worldwide. But Jordan Carter didn't stop there. At an international aviation conference in Paris, Jordan stood at the podium as a senior advisor to the FAA. The room was packed. Industry leaders, veteran pilots, aviation engineers, they weren't here to hear about the past, not about what Titan Airways had done. not about those who had fallen because of greed. They were here to hear about the future. Jordan adjusted the microphone and spoke. Safety is not a destination, it's a journey. Aviation will never stand still. Technology will evolve, airplanes will change, but one thing must remain the same: our responsibility to the people who trust us. His gaze swept across the room. I've seen the worst this industry can produce. I've seen people willing to place profits above human lives, but I've also seen people brave enough to stand up. He let the silence settle for a moment. Then his voice grew firm. Let the lessons of the past remind us there's no such thing as good enough safety. We must always do better. A long round of applause followed. But for Jordan, this wasn't the end. This was just another milestone in the journey. One fall morning, Jordan arrived at Lexington International Airport. As he walked through the terminal, his phone buzzed. A message from Naomi Carter. Do you remember the moment when it all began? Jordan chuckled. He knew exactly what she meant. The first day. The day he had been forced out of the briefing room. The day he had been stripped of his first captaincy. The day he had been looked down upon just for daring to challenge the system. That day had changed him forever. And if he had to do it all again, he wouldn't hesitate. Jordan reached the boarding gate. Nearby, a group of young pilots was preparing for their flight. Among them, one stopped and nodded at him. He recognized her immediately. Maya Roberts. The young woman he had once trained. Now, she was a captain. Jordan nodded back, feeling a quiet pride swell within him. He had helped change aviation safety forever. But more importantly, he had helped create a new generation of pilots. Pilots who would protect the skies long after he was gone. Jordan Carter stepped into his cockpit. He fastened his seatbelt. His hands gently touched the controls. The sky always held new horizons to conquer, and he was far from ready to stop. The journey of Jordan Carter is not just a story of a pilot fighting for the truth. It's a testament to how a single person can change an entire system. From someone forced to wait outside the door, to the man who stood up, faced those in power, and forced an entire industry to change. Today's skies are safer because of those who dared to speak the truth, who dared to fight for what's right. Would you have the courage to do the same? If you were in Jordan's shoes, would you dare to stand up against a flawed system? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.